Welcome, I'm Justin Paperny with Compliance Mitigation. Thank you so much for choosing to enroll in this free webinar, and I'm super excited to introduce my business partner, Michael Santos, who will be one of the instructors in this webinar, along with all of the content we create. Michael, welcome. Can you tell everyone watching a little bit, who are you? How did you end up here?
Yeah, super enthusiastic to participate. What we really strive to do is help people understand how decisions in business can lead to challenges with the criminal justice system, or maybe not even the criminal justice system, just a civil investigation. I made a series of bad decisions that put me into a government investigation more than 30 years ago, and as a result of that government investigation, I served 26 years in federal prison. So we built a series of businesses to try and help honest people understand how to avoid government investigations.
Well, I'm here to help, and I'm super passionate and excited to create this content because when I was an executive, so long ago after graduating USC, I needed this content. The last thing that I ever imagined would happen to me was serving time in federal prison, yet terrible, bad decisions I made took me away from my family. Quickly, for some background, I graduated USC in '97 with a degree in psychology, built my career as a stockbroker at Bear Stearns, ended up at UBS, and some bad decisions, essentially, as my sentencing judge eventually said, you turn the other way for commissions, most salespeople don't get caught, you did, I have to make an example out of you and send you to prison. As a result of those bad decisions, while at UBS, along with no training along the way, I served an 18-month sentence in federal prison. And while there, I met Michael, and we began working with and interviewing and learning from so many people who were just like me, who never imagined they'd become embroiled in a government investigation, who had a long list of regrets, who in retrospect wish there were practical case studies they could actually learn from, rather than some of the training that's so esoteric that frankly could cure insomnia. So I'm passionate about this because, as Michael and I like to say, our team says, we serve the time so you don't have to. We hope you're engaged and you learn from people who never imagined they would end up here. And kind of coming back to who we are, Michael, when I met you in federal prison, I think one of the first things I said was, I never imagined I would end up here. And you said most of the white-collar executives felt that same way. So could you touch on some of the, I guess, ethical lessons or practical lessons you would like to share, what you learned from serving time with so many people who were like me, who never imagined they'd end up here?
There are so many people. Our nation has made a commitment to mass incarceration, and the big growth right now is expanding criminal investigations to bring business people in. In an era of big government, there are just more government investigations every day. And I think that human beings need to learn about how are my decisions today, how are prosecutors or government investigators going to construe the decisions that I'm making on the job. And not only the decisions that I am making as a business leader, but perhaps the decisions that my subordinates are making. One of the lessons that we have learned is that the government provides some real clear guidelines on how to qualify for a deferred prosecution agreement or a non-prosecution agreement. But if somebody doesn't understand that, they don't sow the seeds to get ready for the avoidance of a government investigation. So one thing that we strive to do is help business leaders understand how to do a risk analysis of their company so they can create training programs that are specific to their company. How can they measure those training programs that they are implementing so they can show, hey, we've made a really good faith effort to comply with the law and be a good corporate citizen. They need to understand a little bit more about how my training program leads to lower incidences of crime or violations of compliance. These are extremely costly ventures, and this is really a growth area for financial services industries that can pass this message along to their client base. To the extent that people can understand more about white-collar crime, they can build a model, a revenue stream, but they can also help their people avoid the complexities that can bring really life-changing experiences for anybody that gets wrapped up into this system.
So part of what we want to do through these webinars, I think, is cover some of the collateral consequences that could follow a government investigation, which will then help ensure people are compliant and making really sound decisions. Can you touch on, and maybe we go back and forth, some of the collateral consequences that could follow a government investigation?
Sure. So here's the problem. Most people don't even know how a government investigation begins. If you don't have any knowledge of how a government investigation begins, you don't think you're ever going to be vulnerable. And so what we strive to do in these webinars is give people real insight of what we've learned from interviewing thousands of people that found themselves in the crosshairs of an investigation, and they begin always in secret. Generally, it's fundamentally different from a different type of crime where they may hear of an assault, or they may see a theft, or they may see something. A white-collar investigation begins frequently through email, through some form of fraud, through some form of deception. And there's always a trail. And that trail can lead to a call to the FBI, a call to the FTC, a call to the SEC. It can lead to a newspaper report that can bring an investigator to begin making inquiries. And those inquiries begin in secret, where they might figure out, well, who's the person that we can approach and try to gather more information in secret and offer them something. So they're going to look for somebody low on the totem pole that understands what's going on and try and pull information. What happens to that? A lot of people don't understand what happens to that information. So we want to help business leaders understand the process of white-collar crime and investigations, what the costs are, and then we want to help them avoid it.
So without exaggerating, a presentation like this, it would have changed a large portion of my life. The last thing I imagined, or when I got into trouble, the last thing I ever could have imagined, or when I became an executive, the last thing I could have imagined was getting into trouble. In fact, had I heard this presentation when I was an executive, I might have been somewhat offended, because I could have imagined, as Michael likes to say, getting the rarest disease before I could someday become embroiled in a government investigation. And because of that lack of planning, denial, ignorance, when I got into trouble, I had no idea how to respond. So part of these webinars that we're going to create will help you understand the importance of being compliant, of training your sales team properly, of identifying pressures and rationalizations everyone faces in business. But God forbid if something does happen, if there is a lawsuit, if there is an investigation, how do you respond? I responded poorly. Thousands of people that have reached out to us over the years respond poorly, not ready to own and accept some of the consequences or decisions they've made. And in so doing, they make matters measurably worse. So that's a little bit about my background, an executive who never imagined they'd become immersed in the system, yet I served time in federal prison. I work alongside Michael and our whole team to help you make better decisions to ensure you're not someone that we're counseling through our consulting division who someday may go to federal prison.
I think also as financial services professionals, you need to be thinking about the role that you have and the level of influence that you have, because our nation's prisons are being filled with honest people who, like Justin said, never believed that they would come inside of a system like that. And because they don't understand it, frequently it's not the underlying crime that puts them into the crosshairs of a government investigation and a white-collar criminal prosecution. It's their response. It's what they say. When we think of the famous story of Martha Stewart, who we know went to prison, she didn't go to prison for an underlying crime, but rather how she responded to a government investigation. We want to make sure that your clients don't have that problem, and we want to provide you with a resource that you can use to expand your practice with a kind of a white label compliance training. And we'll be talking about that as we move forward. But if you click down wherever you get your information here of this webinar, we'll provide with you a free download that you can grab a copy of our book, Compliance 101, and we'd like to show you how you can use this as a resource for your team.
So Michael, what I want to transition to now is some of the subjects we're going to cover in our webinars. And when I was an executive, a lot of executives felt like compliance training was an inconvenience, a nuisance, like going to the dentist. We certainly didn't embrace it, and we didn't understand the consequences that would follow. The irony is, by embracing compliance, companies can both make more money and save a lot of money. Can you touch on those subjects for everyone who's watching?
Well, particularly for a financial services firm, if you're an investment banker, if you're a consultant, if you're an accountant, you want to be thinking, why do your customers come to you? They don't only come to you to put numbers in rows and columns, they come to you because they want your professional guidance. And as a financial services professional, you should know that there are more than 4,000 criminal statutes on the books. Some of those criminal statutes are unknown, and your clients need to learn about them. Obviously, you're not going to have the time to become a subject matter expert on all of those clients. So a compliance training program that any financial services firm could offer to its customers can be a great revenue stream because it's an upsell. It's an upsell to something that you do. And especially if you can offer it on a subscription basis where you're getting a stream of revenue for every, on a customer base. So it's like we call it a CAS system, compliance as a service. So we want you to understand how you can offer this as a service, and that's how you make money with a compliance program. How do your consumers save money with a compliance program? Well, the cost of a government investigation really begins in the six-figure range. If you're going to talk with a law firm, you've got to understand what the law firm has to do to defend against an accusation of malfeasance of any kind. It begins by studying every email, looking at every recording, looking at every script, looking at every org chart in your business, looking at every training mechanism, and they're, of course, doing this at $500 to $1,500 an hour. So it's a very costly value proposition, and there's danger that comes with it. Every time you meet with a government investigator, you are speaking to a federal law enforcement officer or a state law enforcement officer, and anytime you speak to a law enforcement officer, there are criminal penalties attached to that. If you make a statement and you're construed as obstructing justice of some kind, that can lead to a charge. If you are making a statement that somehow doesn't align with what the written record shows, you are potentially exposing yourself to some other type of crime. So the more a person learns, the more a person can understand, I can create value for the customers that I serve. I can also save people the enormous risk and complexity of a government investigation.
So some problems or concerns people have had over the years with compliance training is it's boring. It's not engaged. They can't relate to it. Or even WorldCom and Bernie Madoff, which are two very famous white collar crime case studies that go back decades. Even then, people can't relate to that. They want and have been told they want to learn from people they could relate to who are running a small or medium-sized business. They don't want to fall asleep during the compliance training. So for everyone watching, if you choose to enroll in our webinars, these are practical case studies of people just like us who are married, have children, who are running small businesses, yet face some opportunity or seize some opportunity that brought them to a government investigation. We met in federal prison, and you taught me or began to write a lot about these practical case studies. Can you talk about why you think it's easier for people to learn from practical case studies rather than some of these, textbooks that could put you to sleep?
Sure. Well, I started this process decades ago when I knew that I was going to be in prison for a long time, and I started to meet and interact with a lot of business leaders who found themselves in prison, and they all kind of had a similar story. I didn't know that what I was doing could have this outcome. And I began to interview people for a book that I was going to call White Collar. And the whole idea was to do exactly what we're doing right now, help business leaders understand how decisions I make on the job can potentially expose me to a problem. That exposure has to be delivered in a very compelling way, like the story of Dan Enright of Enright Oil, who built a small business, turned it into a $10 million revenue stream on tax-paid fuel, didn't understand that the complexities of excise tax, and found himself in a government investigation, but was so adamant about that he didn't violate the law, that he made a series of decisions that kept getting deeper, where it could have started civilly and been resolved, turned into a criminal case. Then a criminal case turned into a potential penalty of plead guilty to a felony and get probation, but he didn't want to move forward, to an 18-month offer, to a 3-year offer, to I'm going to trial, and eventually he gets convicted and he served 17 years in federal prison. Cost him $10 million, cost him his marriage, These are the types of human stories. We have thousands of them. And those human stories come from every business sector, from every vertical, whether it's business to business, business to consumer, business to enterprise, business to government. All of them have complexities. We want to show people how individuals find themselves targeted by the government and what they can do to improve those outcomes.
So one case study or one webinar we're going to film, the majority of people who reach out to us usually open up by saying the same thing. I didn't have bad intent. And our response is, of course you didn't have bad intent. Who wakes up and says, today I'm going to ruin my career, lose my reputation, potentially go to prison, create victims? It's a series of subtle decisions over a period of time that can get you embroiled in this process. One of the webinars will feature a client we call Joshua, the CFO, who was an accountant, who every day had access to more than $2 million in capital. Had he had a real criminal mind, he could have stolen that money. He could have wired the money and gone offshore and done something. Yet it was a series of small decisions over a Black American Express card that led him to federal prison for 21 months. These are stories we can relate to because Joshua, like me, didn't have bad intentions when I began. So we're going to share a series of those types of case studies ranging from accountants who have engaged in securities fraud, bank fraud, mail fraud. We're going to cover PPP, or the Payroll Protection Program, case studies. And of course, I share when I came home from prison 10, 11 years ago, it was the Ponzi scheme and a lot of mortgage fraud. Well, now it's payroll protection fraud and government investigators really looking to advance their agenda on these cases. And that's how I want to come back to you for a moment, Michael. I want you to touch on this. In our work, you talk a lot about the stakeholders. Right. When I got in trouble, I wanted them to view me as a USC athlete, as a stockbroker, or someone who volunteered in my community. Instead, they were looking at me at this lens like, this guy's a criminal. And I didn't want that perception. I wanted them to perceive me as I did. Talk about how the perception changes once you become embroiled in this system.
It changes the second that a government agency chooses to advance and chooses to move forward. And from that moment, the person becomes the defendant. And when we're thinking about that moment, we have to put our mindset not in how we see ourselves. I don't think that you're unusual in wanting the world to see you as how you see yourself. We need to think about the lens of the person investigating us. What do they want? Right? What's success for that person? That person is not after justice. That person is after a conviction. That's how that person's career is going to advance. That person is going to get a reputation for bringing what they would call a dishonest or deceitful person down. And to the extent that we can begin from that pathway, we can start creating compliance training programs to address that. And we can do that just by looking at all white-collar crimes. People that engage in white-collar crimes, as you say, generally don't start out with an intent to defraud. It's something happens and they believe, well, if I just move from here to here or keep one set of books with this information and another set of books with another information, or they're not recognizing all of the complexities there and how much time an investigator is going to put into uncovering that. So we really want to help people understand how to develop a best-in-class compliance program, how to really tell the story of their business and demonstrate their training tools and what they're doing to document it. Because if they can't defend it, if they can't tell that story, the government investigator is going to tell a different story. And that different story is not going to be about you being a USC athlete. What it's going to be about is you being a criminal. And they're going to stake their career on it. That's what their promotion is going to be staked on. And that's what's going to frame the narrative.
Well, something we're going to cover in these webinars is properly responding to a government investigation, along with some of the consequences that accompany a government investigation. The majority of people who reach out to us who are under indictment or have gotten a Wells letter from the Securities and Exchange Commission, they hear the word federal prison and they think of things they see sensationalized on television. Cool Hand Luke, Shawshank Redemption. They're scared to death about prison. I think initially they think that's the only consequence, when in many cases, it's just one of so many things people have to deal with. So what I'd like to discuss for a few minutes, and something we're going to cover in a webinar, all of the collateral consequences that accompany a civil or criminal investigation. Can you touch on that? And I'd love to chime in as well.
Yeah, when I talk about a collateral consequence, I think of things that are completely outside of the charge and outside of even the investigation. People, as you just described, come into the system only thinking about, oh my God, by the time they're reaching us, they're already saying, how do I get a lower sentence? Because they're consumed with the sentence. The collateral consequences are the afterlife. You see, a government investigation, or particularly a charge, has an afterlife. Sure, there's going to be a series of judicial proceedings that are very formal. But there's going to come a time when that sentence ends. That's when the collateral consequences kick in, such as a bank telling you to get your money out of the account, which can have devastating consequences, particularly if it was in an IRA type of a program. There are going to be aspects of voting. There's going to be aspects of travel. There's going to be aspects of housing. There's going to be reputational damage. These are the collateral consequences, things that don't have anything to do with a crime, anything to do with a sanction. But they can influence what you do with the rest of your life, where you can go, when you can go. And to the extent that people understand that, they can start sowing seeds that hopefully will get them a better outcome.
A client a while back told me I would have served 3 times as long if I didn't have to deal with all of the financial repercussions that follow restitution. And this is where I'd like you to touch on conspiracy for a moment, because this executive earned $100,000 over a course of about 18 months just in commissions and selling stuff. But because he was, they said, engaged in a conspiracy, he was tied to this massive multi-million-dollar loss or restitution that he's now responsible for paying, along with people in this conspiracy he didn't meet. So long after the prison term ends, you're beholden to a probation officer looking to collect, and that, as you mentioned, buying a home, putting liens on homes. So talk a little bit about how someone who could make $80,000 in a salary could somehow be tied to a multi-million-dollar restitution.
Well, that would go back to the sentencing hearing. And generally, when there is any type of an investigation, you should begin thinking about the federal sentencing guidelines, which will have a finding of fact. Now, you may not agree with that finding of fact, and that is the loss amount. So if there is a fraud, the probation officer will allege this was the amount of loss that happened. That loss could be, if it's a securities type of violation. I'll give you an example of a friend of ours who was a CEO of a publicly traded company. The stock was trading at $40 before the alleged fraud. It dropped to $10, let's say. It lost 75% of its market value. That 75% loss in market value was measured in the billions of dollars. So the prosecutor would argue that the loss amount was $1 billion. Well, he's going to make a different case. It doesn't matter what his position was. It's going to be, what was that loss amount that the probation officer argued? Defense attorney is going to contest that. Then there's going to be a judge that's going to make a finding of fact. That finding of fact is going to say the loss amount was $50 million. Well, now, regardless of what you earn in the future, you could have exposure to paying that $50 million. You could have been an underling in a greater fraud, but there could be joint and several liability, which means everybody is liable for the total amount of loss, regardless of what role you played in it. You might be a secretary, but if the government alleges that you were part of the conspiracy, you're responsible for the entire amount of fraud, and that can hang over you for 20 years after you get out of prison.
Something we're going to cover in this webinar is, if unfortunately you're caught up in a government investigation, civil or criminal, steps you can put in place to overcome it. Michael has yet to mention he served 26 consecutive years in federal prison on a 45-year sentence. And I would argue you've been successful through a long record of working hard, of overcoming some of these collateral consequences that follow a long prison record. So through these webinars, we want to cover, how do you begin to overcome some of these collateral consequences? Can you touch on there's a million strategies, touch on 2 or 3, because someone watching this, they may have civil lawsuits. They may have complaints on message boards from employees, or unhappy they didn't get that raise or bonus, some negative reviews they have to contend with, which isn't bringing in as many, everything's on the table. How do you begin to overcome some of these collateral consequences?
I think that's a good question, and it was a good caveat when you said that there are a million ways. But in all reality, anybody who's watching this video is already successful in their career. And that didn't happen by accident. in the same strategy that it took to become successful in your career is the same strategy it takes to prepare for a collateral consequence. It begins by defining the best possible outcome. If you're a financial services professional, that didn't happen by accident. There was a time in your life, whether you decided to go to an undergraduate program and get a degree, and then perhaps a graduate degree, and then get professional licensing or go to a professional school, and you sowed the seeds to become successful. Same here. The more you understand about compliance, the more you understand about white-collar crime, the more you understand about sentencing, you're going to understand that mitigation strategies have many different components and many different layers. And what you have to do is prepare for every one of those layers. Prepare for the stage that how you're going to respond if you get wrapped into a system. When's the best time to prepare? Long before the investigation begins. Then you want to be thinking about if it escalates to a criminal charge. How do I prepare for that? If I don't understand it, you're at the mercy of a defense attorney who may have a different objective than you have. So you want to understand so that you can work more effectively with that attorney. You want to understand the federal sentencing guidelines. That's a way to prepare, because if I understand, I can mitigate. I can create strategies to overcome. If I'm going to be sentenced, I want to prepare. All of these, the more we understand, we define success, put priorities in place, we create our tools, tactics, and resources, and we execute the plan. The same way you become successful as a stockbroker.
Well, as we continue topics we're going to cover in the webinar, we'll transition into how you can maintain an ethical culture, yet still be aggressive and bring in sales. And we'll touch on and share case studies in these webinars of companies who have done exactly that. As we continue on topics we're going to cover through the webinars, we're going to talk about values and ethics. And the irony, so many people become immersed in this system, yet they had a corporate code of ethics within their company. They had a value system that guided them, yet here they are. So Michael, I'd like to defer to you and share a story or two of someone, good father, good husband, ethical, employed and hired a lot of people, yet they found themselves here embroiled in a government investigation. So I'd love for you to share a story or two for people watching.
Let's talk about Brandon. Brandon's a client of ours who just got out of federal prison, but he's the guy that has the backstory that nobody would ever think would go to federal prison, just like everybody that's watching this video right now. Brandon grew up in a middle-class, blue-collar family, put himself through undergrad school, went and realized that an undergraduate school was not going to help him achieve his dream of becoming a financial services professional. So he took a course that would make him a master of Excel spreadsheets. He used that, leveraged that knowledge to become a private equity investor, got brought on by a firm, started to succeed in that role, and then eventually went on to put his own deals together. And when he put his own deals together, what happened? He had to partner with other people that were subject matter experts in their vertical, in their domain. Brandon's a finance guy, private equity guy. He put up some capital. He decided to become their CFO. But when these guys were architecting a business model that he didn't have any understanding of, he didn't understand biology, he didn't understand nutrition, he didn't understand these types of concepts, he would just have to buy into what they were telling him. And so he didn't take the effort to really understand every aspect of the business. Because he couldn't really explain it, he was in a very weak position when a government investigation began. He became subject to that accusation that you either knew or you should have known. And your lack of asking the right questions has brought some criminal negligence, some criminal liability. And as a result, collateral consequences, goes through millions of dollars in litigation fees, loses tens of millions of dollars in equity, puts his wife through sleepless nights, has tarnished his reputation, has served time in federal prison, and is now standing up for count in a federal halfway house. Why? Because he didn't ask the right questions at the right time. And so we as business leaders and business owners have to recognize our prisons are filled with people who very likely have a plausible argument that should have been charged civilly. But that's not going to move the needle. Just because you feel you shouldn't have been charged criminally is irrelevant. Who is your accuser? What does your accuser want? How does your accuser define success? What can you do to understand that accuser and to protect yourself? If you don't go through compliance training where you're learning human stories instead of the kinds of stories that typical compliance training will offer, are you going to be weaker or stronger?
So a lot of people who come across our work will say, my boss told me to do it, or maybe I didn't have the experience at the time. I felt pressured. I was one of many people who were engaging this. I'm referring to telemarketing, just a lot of schemes. And in retrospect, I'll say, I wish I would have spoken up. I wish I would have done more. So can you touch on how a good compliance training program encourages collaboration, even some dissension, whether it's anonymous or not? Because some people are afraid to speak up. Maybe it costs them their job. And clients have told us, maybe it cost me my job and that rent that month, but I still have my freedom. So talk about how a compliance program should encourage collaboration, even some dissension, just openness.
Well, I think, again, it starts with a story, right? I want to hear what happened to Jim. I want to hear what's Jim's profession and do I identify with Jim? If Jim is a inveterate criminal and starts out with a mindset of scheming to defraud, maybe you're not going to identify with that guy. But what if Jim is a guy who's having an affair, is an unfaithful husband? How can being an unfaithful husband lead to a federal prison sentence? Well, if you don't understand money laundering laws, you don't know. But here was Jim's case. Jim was having an affair. He was going through a very litigious divorce. He was a very successful businessman, had numerous ventures, and he paid his taxes and did everything, in his view, did everything right. But when one of his companies began to have some liquidity events, he said, you know what? I don't want that going through my joint accounts. Why don't you just cut me a check for $9,000? He said, let's just get me $9,000 a month, but give me a check that I can just cash. He tells his banker, I just want to cash this check because I really just don't want it deposited in my account. I'm not saying he didn't declare it on his taxes. I'm saying he just cashed that check. And so that's what he would do every week, cash this check. And what did he do with that check? He did it so he could give the cash to his mistress. But what he was doing at the same time was violating a very esoteric law known as cash structuring. Anytime somebody has a pattern of engaging in financial transactions that are below the threshold of $10,000, that person is committing a crime that has no defense. As a result, went to prison for 6 months. He's now a felon. He can never again be an officer of a publicly traded company, so they've taken his livelihood, and they've really just obstructed his life. No intention to commit a crime, but he did commit a crime. That's why we want to have compliance training, to help people understand and learn. And Jim's an interesting guy. So the more we learn about Jim, I'm going to identify things that, geez, that could happen to me, okay? And we can give many examples of that, and it's that type of relationship. And I'd love to give you some more if you're interested in case studies like that.
I'm interested in case studies because we're going to cover them through hours and hours of content we're going to create. So we have so many. Share one more for everyone watching because we want you to sign up. We want you to enroll. We want you to learn from them.
And we want you to learn to help your clients, right? We said that this can help you make money and save money. We want to help you develop a new revenue stream, and you can do so by telling the story of Adam. Adam's the guy that I served time with in federal prison. He didn't have a college education. He just was one of these skilled guys that learned how to program computers when he was a kid and became very skilled at Word, what was it called? Whatever it was called in the beginning. I was in prison at the time, but it was called Front Page on Microsoft. And you could build websites, and he'd build these websites for people, and he became skilled in Adobe Photoshop and InDesign and create brochures and became artistic. And he found, you know what? People like you that studied accounting may not know how to do that. So he'd start selling these services. And then he built a pretty successful little company with 10 or 15 little graphic designers and web designers and copywriters working for him. And one day a customer comes in. And says, hey, I've got a great new nutritional supplement company that I'd love for you to design for me. Build me the website. Build me the marketing materials. Do the labeling for me. I'll provide you the copy of what it does. He says, great, here's my team. They design the packaging. They design the website. They put it up. They send it out. FDA comes along and says, wait a minute, you're advertising something that you don't have the right to advertise. Web designer doesn't know anything about it. They go after the supplement company. Fine. What does the supplement company do when he's involved in an investigation? I confess he did it. And of course, when that happens, the investigation goes to the web designer. The web designer doesn't know anything about a government investigation. He says, I didn't do anything. Starts off, first of all, with denial, getting himself into further trouble. Then, of course, there's the concept of vicarious liability, knew or should have known, and you're violating FDA laws. You get involved in the investigation, you respond wrong. What's next? 18 months in federal prison, loss of your business, collateral consequences that will stay with you for a lifetime. If you don't know, you can't protect. That's why we want to help you protect.
Michael, I want to spend some time in one of the webinars we're going to cover white-collar crime. Big term, a lot of attention, a lot of TV shows and hype around white-collar crime. Can you touch on how a white-collar crime investigation can actually begin?
Well, let's start off by just even addressing that term, because that's not a legal term. White-collar crime is a sociological term. There's no law book that talks about white-collar crime. It's just crime. It's fraud. It's generally a crime that involves deceit of some type of way. And how does that begin? It begins with an accusation of either misrepresentation, deception, fraudulent conveyance of assets, something, bribery, money laundering, obviously wire fraud, mail fraud, securities fraud, tax fraud. There's just so many of them. It's just crime, right? And a lot of times I think an audience forgets that we have different branches of government, right? Congress passes laws, the executive branch of government executes laws, and the judiciary determines facts. So if we go back to civics class, we kind of remember that it's Congress that passes the laws, and it's the executive branch that's going to make sure that we abide by them. But what happens? First, there's an investigation where there's a tremendous gathering of data, gathering of what the government would argue are facts. And those facts are going to tell a story, generally through a series of emails and bank transactions, and they're really relatively easy to prove because if the process was not followed, there's going to be a track record, and that track record is going to expose somebody to a problem. That problem will go to a prosecutor. The prosecutor will convene a grand jury. That grand jury is going to weigh the evidence, and there will be no defense attorney there. There will be nobody there arguing the other side. It will only be the government's version of events, which is why that cliche holds that a good prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich. So it's just a team of citizens on a grand jury who are making an assessment, just following the lead of the prosecutor. After a grand jury returns an indictment, there will be that horrendous perp walk where authorities will generally come banging on the door at 6 in the morning and embarrass you in your home by pulling you out with 20 armed federal agents pulling you out. We're showing up at your place of business with their windbreakers on and that command, stepping away from the computers, the investigation has begun, and they will corral you. You, as a business owner, need to have a plan for that, even though it may never happen. Just like you have fire insurance, you want to have it in place so everybody kind of understands what's happening, and you've got a good plan to teach people how should we respond in an ethical, prudent way to minimize our exposure to problems. After that investigation, there's going to be a charging decision, and that charging decision could result in dismissal of charges, but if the government has brought an indictment, that's very rare. In fact, a federal judge would have to approve it. After that charging decision, there will be a plea hearing. Generally, people are going to plead not guilty. Then, eventually, there will be plea negotiations. The government may have a proffer session or a reverse proffer session where they will say, here's everything we have against you, Mr. Defendant. Tell us why we shouldn't indict. Tell us why we shouldn't move forward. As we saw, that's recently going on right now in the news with the president's CFO, right? Why shouldn't we indict? Couldn't make the case. He's now a defendant in a criminal case, looking at time in prison. After that charging decision, we've got a plea, either not guilty or guilty. Generally, people are going to plead guilty with a plea agreement. Then there's going to be a pre-sentence investigation report, and I'm going to let you take it from there.
Well, one thing we have to cover, it was Tom Petty who said waiting is the hardest part, how long it can take for all of these steps to wait out. And it is incredible how many people, once they're ultimately sentenced to prison, are actually excited to get to prison because at least they can begin to get credit for the time served. In my case, it was January 5th, 2005 to April 28th, 2008 till I surrendered to prison. The 3 years were a difficult part of the journey, and that's the case for most everyone who comes into the system. So it's not as easy if, unfortunately, you become immersed in this. It's not it begins and it's over with within a week. It could take many years to play out, and then there's life after prison. Back to the probation interview, which is something I wasn't necessarily prepared for, and it was an experience where I sat with a probation officer and they probed and asked questions about my life. Felt somewhat invasive. They were violating and they wanted information that they needed, and I didn't fully understand at the time why they were asking these questions, that it was ultimately going to make its way to a federal judge who, at my sentencing, Judge Wilson asked me the first question, have you read the probation report? I said, yes, Your Honor. At that moment, I realized the importance of it. So I'm going to turn back to you for the probation report. Can you touch on the importance of it, why it's created, and why it can impact someone both at sentencing but also while in custody?
In the federal system, which is where most white-collar people that go through white-collar crimes or have compliance issues when it goes into a system, it's generally going to be wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering. These are like the basic white-collar crime charges. There's going to be a pre-sentence investigation report. Here's what's going to happen. A probation officer is going to interview you and is going to get your side of the story. Before that probation officer has interviewed you, it already has, that person already has the government's version of events. So this investigation will begin. We'd like to say it's unbiased, but it's really not, because the probation officer has been fed this information. And just think about it, right? Your name is Joe Stevens, and there's an indictment, and it says United States of America versus Joe Stevens. No human being is going to look at you as if you're, a candidate for sainthood or a model citizen. Wow, you got indicted. Something must be wrong. Where there's smoke, there's fire. That's just human nature. So it starts from this premise of, you're a defendant. I've got a U.S. attorney telling me you did something wrong. I want to hear from you, but I'm going to look at you with a little bit of cynicism in my eye. And everything you say has massive implications. It could expose you to obstruction of justice charges. It could expose you to loss of eligibility for programs if you go to prison that could result in you coming out sooner. It could influence the level of liberty you have on the other side. So this pre-sentence investigation report has implications that last long beyond the sentencing. I can't give you all of that in this introductory interview, which is why we produce a series of 1-hour training sessions that we want you to understand. So you might want to sign up for our course on the pre-sentence investigation, where we'll not only give you real-life examples of people that have prepared well and people that prepared not so well, what could be done differently. To the extent you understand that, we think that we can empower you to empower your clients. And so I think that that's a synopsis, that the pre-sentence investigation report isn't only for sentencing. It's for everything that follows. It becomes a very important document that probation officers and a judge, again, will look at years down the road. So you want to do your part to sow seeds that you can somehow influence that investigation report.
So let's spend a couple of minutes talking how someone can prepare for the shortest possible sentence after the probation interview. For example, in my case, my co-defendant was more culpable than me, yet because of better decisions he made earlier in the investigation, had an opportunity to cooperate against me in what's called, he was on his way to obtaining what's called a 5K1 letter, a cooperation letter from the government. So talk about some steps between even the investigation and sentencing that defendants can put in play to position themselves to get the possible shorter sentence.
Again, I can only give you the abbreviated version on that, which is why we offer a full course on that subject matter. And it's a subject matter that I think people need to hear, even if it never comes into play. They may have a client and they are better capable of advising that client. Oh, I've never been in that situation, but I remember seeing this video out by compliance mitigation team that spoke about what they should learn. So we got a full webinar on that subject matter, but let me now just kind of respond. We have to think about mitigation in terms of, well, I think in your business, it's know your customer, right? That's a law in the finance space. You got to know your customer to make sure that you are not participating in any type of nefarious activity. I want you now to be thinking about know these stakeholders that you're going to face in the future, starting with the probate, starting really with the investigator, going to the prosecutor, going to the probation officer that's going to write this report, going to the judge, going to the case manager that will oversee you in prison, going to the job supervisor that will oversee you in prison, going to the case manager in the halfway house when you go home, going to the probation officer that will assess your level of liberty on the other side, going to the judge that may make an assessment on whether you can travel. To the extent that you understand all of those areas, you can start sowing seeds to build a mitigation strategy, starting at the soonest possible time. It's never too early and it's never too late. But what are some of those things that you can do? Well, you can really work on your statement of remorse. You can really work on building a record that shows I didn't just, find Jesus and miss my kids. I've done some really creative methods to help people understand I'm not defined by this criminal act. In fact, this is an aberration in my life. And I want to show you who I really am. And you got to become a master at telling that story. And that's why our 1-hour course on this subject will show you people who've done it well and people who've done it not so well, and what are some of the ramifications. To the extent you understand that, you will be in a better position.
Michael, unfortunately, people who become embroiled in a white-collar crime investigation and plead guilty, there is a great likelihood they are going to serve time on the wrong side of prison boundaries, go to prison. Can you share some stories, successful stories in prison, along with some stories where someone's life continues to just go from bad to worse?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. I love to tell the story about my friend Gary, who had a law degree and had an MBA. And he was a really successful money manager in Los Angeles representing celebrities. Sadly, he made a decision that put him in the crosshairs of a government investigation and then a prison term where he got 36 months. So Gary and I became very good friends while we were together. After he finished his sentence, he went home, looking forward to rebuilding his life. His wife was still with him, and one of his closest friends had passed away, and Gary had played a very influential role in this person's children. So particularly when his friend passed away, and his daughter was getting married. His friend's daughter was getting married, and she asked Gary to be the best man at her wedding. Problem was, she lived in a different jurisdiction. We have many jurisdictions in the United States. Gary was in Los Angeles. The daughter lived in Las Vegas. Gary had to ask permission to go to the wedding. And when she asked that permission, the probation officer didn't respond. And by the time he got the response, the wedding had taken place, so Gary never went. He made a decision at that moment that said, if I ever get a situation where I got to go out of town again, I'm just not going to ask. I'm just going to go. And as a result of that decision, he went to San Diego once. He went to San Francisco once. He went to Bakersfield once. All fine until he was about 2 weeks away from finishing his term on supervised release. What happens next? His probation officer says, Gary, I'd love to see your credit card receipts on what you've done over the past 3 years. When she looked at those credit card receipts, she saw that he bought gasoline in Bakersfield. He stayed at a hotel in San Diego. He booked a flight to San Francisco. She says, I never gave you permission to do that. As a result, Gary went back to prison. This time his wife told him, I stayed with you one time, can't stay with you a second time. So he lost his family and really went into a period of devastating depression that had enormous implications. That's the example of somebody who doesn't understand the system. But he was a CPA, he was an MBA, he was a lawyer. Should he have known? Absolutely.
So Michael, we've shared some of the horror stories that can follow a federal prison sentence. Let's share a case study or two of success as we wrap up this webinar.
I can't think of a better success story than you, Justin. I mean, you came to prison lost like many white-collar guys, but you completely reinvented yourself. And that all began with a conversation we had when we watched Bernie Madoff go down. Do you remember that question I asked you?
Well, you asked me a lot of questions. You still do, but the question might have included, what is success for you in 5 years, 10 years?
Certainly that was a question, but at the time was, do you think you're the only guy that doesn't understand government investigations and white-collar crime? There's a business model here, and let's create it. And then we worked on it, and we created it, and as a result, we've worked on helping more than 10,000 people who've gone through this process figure out steps they can take to get the best possible outcome. So you got out of prison in what year?
2009.
And what was the economy like in 2009 for those of us who have a short memory?
It was the Great Recession, as they called it.
It was the Great Recession, and yet because you were creating an innovative business model that would help people understand, hey, this is a subject matter that I might want to learn about, you became a subject matter expert. And I would say that's an example of a best possible outcome, is that you go to prison thinking your life is spiraling out of control, but instead you find a way to recalibrate, rebuild, and come back stronger than ever.
Well, I appreciate the nice words. I think part of our success, or anyone's success, you have to embrace sort of starting over. So it's easy 12 or 13 years later to look at the success, but I recall when I was released from prison, I was picking up phones in the halfway house, and I used to write you letters and say, I was a high-end real estate agent and I was a stockbroker, I'm picking up phones, and you'd like to say, it's just part of the journey. Keep growing, keep building. And I'd love for you to close about embracing the journey, and then we'll wrap it up by encouraging everyone to enroll in our seminar.
You know, at the end of the day, if you're going through this program, that's a great sign. We're going to encourage you, don't go through the program of compliance training with the idea of getting a certificate or filling the hours on your professional resume, but rather listen and learn from people who've gone through this, listen to the pain that they have endured, and think introspectively, what can I do to make sure this doesn't happen to my team? This doesn't happen to me. This doesn't happen to the clients that I serve. And to the extent you ask those questions well, you'll be able to come up with a strategy. And if you come up with a strategy, you can put your priorities in place. And then you can create your tools, tactics, and resources and make sure that you are always in compliance and outside the purview or the interest of federal prosecutors, which may have a very different view of the value you bring to yourself, to your clients, and to your business.
Well said. And I will close by thanking all of you for watching. We recognize you have a lot of content creators to choose from, and we'd be grateful. And we hope you have an opportunity to go through the programs and webinars that Michael, I, and our team are going to create. So thank you so much for watching.
And remember, we did the time so you won't have to.